Mark had worked at the same company for 11 years. Quiet, reliable, never late, never asked for much. So when his boss called him into the office and offered him the biggest promotion of his career, everyone expected him to say yes. He looked at the paper. He looked at the number. Then he slid it back across the desk. "No, thank you." The room went silent. His boss blinked, confused. "Nobody says no to this, Mark. Can I ask why?" Mark just smiled, picked up his coat, and walked out without another word. That evening, he picked up his daughter from school like always, but this time, her teacher was waiting for him by the gate. Her face was serious. She stepped closer, lowered her voice, and said the one sentence Mark never expected to hear from a stranger. "I know exactly why you said no, and it has nothing to do with your job." Mark froze, because she wasn't supposed to know. Nobody was supposed to know. If this story touches your heart, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Mark Dawson was the kind of man people forgot to notice, and that was exactly how he liked it. 11 years at Caldwell Logistics had taught him the safest place to stand was the background. His desk held only one photograph, turned slightly toward the wall, just enough that no one walking past could see the woman's face inside. His daughter Emma was 7, missing her 2 front teeth, and the only person left on earth who could make him laugh out loud. Every evening he picked her up at exactly 3:15, not a minute late, because he had promised her that, and it was a promise he intended to keep, no matter what it cost him. That Thursday started like any other, which was exactly why nothing warned him. His supervisor stopped by his desk around 10 and asked him up to the 7th floor, a floor Mark had never once set foot on in 11 years. He was led into a corner office where Richard Caldwell, the owner's son, sat behind a desk with a folder already open. Richard smiled the way people smile when they already know your answer. He slid the folder across. Regional Director, the letter read, with a number that made Mark's chest tighten. More money than he had ever seen in a year. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to finally take Emma somewhere warm. Richard reached for his pen, already certain. And that was the moment something cold settled low in Mark's stomach. Because printed at the top of the letter, just above his name, was a client account he hadn't seen in writing in nearly 4 years. A name he had prayed he would never see again. Mark looked at the paper a long time, long enough that Richard's smile began to fade. He looked at the number. He looked at the name above it. Then, slowly, he slid the folder back, the way you hand back something that had burned you. "I appreciate it," Mark said quietly, "but I can't take this." Richard blinked, genuinely thrown, the kind of confusion that comes from never once hearing the word no. "Did you just say no? Nobody turns this down. Can I ask why?" Mark stood, buttoned his jacket, and met his eyes for the first time since walking in. "It's personal," he said. "I have to go pick up my daughter." He turned and walked out, before Richard could say another word, leaving the folder closed, and a question hanging in the air he had no intention of answering. By the time he reached the schoolyard, his hands had finally stopped shaking, or so he told himself. Emma spotted him and came sprinting, backpack bouncing, a drawing clutched tight in one fist. He crouched down, scooped her into a hug, and for a moment the office, the folder, the name on that letter, all felt very far away. "I drew you a rocket ship, Daddy," she announced, holding up crayon flames on paper. "It goes to the moon, and never has to come back down." Mark laughed, a real laugh, the first one all day, and told her it was the finest rocket ship he had ever seen. He took her hand and started toward the gate, the weight in his chest loosening, just slightly. That was when he noticed her near the gate, separate from the other parents. Emma's homeroom teacher, the one who sent home friendly notes about spelling tests. Except today she wasn't smiling. She watched him approach with an expression that had no business at school pickup, careful, deliberate, like she had been waiting specifically for him. Mark slowed without quite meaning to. Emma, chattering about her rocket ship, didn't notice a thing. The teacher stepped away from the small cluster of parents and walked, slowly, straight toward him. "Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Could I have a moment?" The cold feeling from Richard's office returned at once. He glanced at Emma, off inspecting a ladybug on the fence, then back at the teacher, whose eyes hadn't moved from his face. "Is everything all right? Is Emma okay?" She shook her head, just slightly, and stepped closer, close enough that he saw her hands trembling around a folder pressed to her chest, a folder that, for one disorienting second, looked almost exactly like the one Richard had slid across his desk that morning. "This isn't about Emma," she said. "It's about you." She glanced once toward the parking lot, checking no one was close enough to hear. Then she looked back at him, and something in her face cracked open, something close to grief. "I heard what happened today at Caldwell. I heard you turned down the promotion." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. There was no way she could know that. He hadn't told a single soul. "How could you?" he started, but she cut him off, her voice dropping lower, shaking now for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. "I know exactly why you said no, Mark, and it has nothing to do with your job." She drew in a breath, like someone stepping off a ledge she had been standing on for years. "It's about Claire." Claire. The name landed in Mark's chest, like a stone dropped into still water. He hadn't heard anyone outside his own family say it out loud in almost 4 years. Not since the funeral, not since the world quietly moved on without her in it. He stared at the teacher, at her trembling hands, at the folder pressed against her chest, and for a moment his mouth wouldn't work at all. "How do you know that name?" he finally managed, barely above a whisper. The teacher's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "Because Claire was my sister," she said. "My name is Diane. Claire Whitfield was my baby sister, before she became Claire Dawson." Mark felt the ground tilt slightly beneath him. In 11 years at Caldwell, he had never once heard that name from a stranger at a school gate. He had buried Claire's maiden name, along with everything else. "I didn't know Claire had a sister," he said. "She told me her family was gone." Diane's jaw tightened, something painful moving across her face. "There was a falling out, long before you two met. A bad one. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 6 years by the time she passed. I found out about the accident from a newspaper clipping a cousin mailed me, 3 weeks after it happened." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her lips together, fighting to hold herself steady in a schoolyard full of children and minivans. Mark glanced at Emma, still crouched by the fence, absorbed in her ladybug, unaware the ground was shifting under her father, 10 feet away. He lowered his voice further. "What does this have to do with the promotion?" Diane took a breath, like bracing herself to say something rehearsed 100 times and never spoken aloud. "The client account on that letter," she said. "Whitfield Shipping, our family's company, our father's company, the one Claire walked away from when she married you, the one he said he'd rather burn down than let either daughter touch again." Mark's stomach dropped through the pavement. "Caldwell does business with your father," he said slowly. "And if I take that promotion, I'd be managing that exact account." "You'd be working directly with him," Diane said. "With our father, the same man who told Claire at her own wedding she was choosing a nobody over her own blood. The same man who never once called to ask about his granddaughter, not one birthday, in 7 years." Mark closed his eyes. The folder, the number on that page, rearranged itself into something far heavier than an opportunity. It wasn't a promotion. It was a door swinging open to a man who had spent his life proving he wanted nothing to do with them. "I didn't know," Mark said quietly. "I just saw the account name and knew I couldn't sit across from anyone connected to that world again. I didn't know the rest. I didn't know about you." Diane wiped quickly at her eyes, glancing around to make sure no other parents were watching too closely. "I started teaching here 2 years ago," she said. "I saw your daughter's last name on the roster and told myself it was coincidence. But then I saw her at pickup, and Mark, she has Claire's exact smile, the same gap in her teeth my sister had at that age. I have known for 2 years who that girl belongs to, and I haven't said a word, because I didn't know how, and because I was afraid of what it might do to all of us. A car door slammed somewhere behind them, and Diane flinched like she'd been caught at something. She glanced at Emma, who had abandoned the ladybug and was skipping in slow circles, singing to herself, unbothered by the world. "I'm not telling you this to complicate your life," Diane said, her voice steadying slightly. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know someone else out here loved her too. Someone closer than you ever realized." She reached out, almost touched his arm, then stopped, like even that felt like too much, too soon. "There's more you don't know, about why she really left home, about what happened the night before the wedding. I've carried it for years because I promised her I would, and I don't know anymore if that's protecting you or just protecting myself." Mark stood frozen on the pavement, the autumn wind pulling at his coat, his daughter laughing somewhere behind him, and a woman in front of him holding a piece of his late wife's life he never knew existed. "Tell me," he said. Diane opened her mouth to answer, then her eyes shifted, just for a second, toward the parking lot, and whatever she saw there drained every bit of color from her face. "We can't do this here," she whispered. "He's here. My father is here." If you've ever kept a secret to protect someone you love, even if it cost you, don't be afraid to say so in the comments below. This story isn't here to judge anyone, only to remind us that the people who hold back the truth often do it out of love, not deception. Mark turned, following Diane's gaze toward the parking lot, and his stomach tightened again. An older man stood beside a black sedan, tall and rigid, in a charcoal coat out of place among the minivans and strollers. He wasn't moving. He just watched them, his eyes fixed on Diane, with an intensity that made the hair rise on the back of Mark's neck. "That's your father," Mark said quietly, not really a question. Diane nodded once, her hand tightening around the folder. "He's known I teach here for months, I think, and he's never come close enough to see her. Until today." Mark glanced back at Emma, still skipping near the fence, unaware that the grandfather who had never called her, never sent a card, never asked one question about her in 7 years, was standing less than 100 feet away. "We need to go," Diane whispered, already stepping back, putting distance between them as if proximity itself were dangerous. "Please, not here, not in front of her." Mark felt a flash of anger rise in his chest, sharp and immediate. After everything she had just told him, she wanted to walk away and leave it swinging in the wind. "You can't just say all that and disappear," Mark said, lowering his voice but not softening it. "You said there's more. You said something happened the night before the wedding." Diane's eyes flicked back toward the parking lot, where the man hadn't moved an inch, his presence somehow louder than if he'd been shouting. "There's a coffee shop, 2 blocks from here," she said quickly. "Bennett's, on 5th. Tomorrow morning, after drop-off. I'll tell you everything. Just not while he's standing right there watching us." Before Mark could answer, Emma came running back, her cheeks pink from the cold, the ladybug apparently released back into the wild.
"Daddy, can Miss Diane come over for dinner sometime?"
she asked, completely oblivious to the storm above her head. "She's my favorite teacher in the whole entire world." Diane's face crumpled for half a second, something raw passing across it, before she forced a smile back into place. She crouched down to Emma's level, the same way Claire used to crouch. Mark noticed suddenly, the exact same tilt of the head. "I would love that, sweetheart," Diane said, her voice thick. "More than you know." She stood quickly, gave Mark one last look, loaded with everything she hadn't said yet, and turned to walk briskly toward the staff lot, deliberately moving away from where her father still stood watching. Mark took Emma's hand and started toward his car, forcing his legs to move like everything was normal, like his understanding of his late wife's life hadn't just been rearranged in 10 minutes. As he reached the edge of the lot, he glanced once more toward the black sedan. The old man was still there, but now his eyes weren't on Diane. They were on Mark. For one long moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the rows of parked cars, two strangers who shared the same dead woman between them, one who had raised her and pushed her away, one who had loved her until the very end. Then, Slowly, the old man raised a hand, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, the kind you give someone you've watched a long time without ever introducing yourself. Mark's chest went tight. He didn't raise his hand back. That night, after Emma was asleep, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table, with coffee going cold in front of him, the photograph from his desk finally pulled out of the drawer, turned face up, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Claire smiled back at him, young, sunlit, laughing at something just out of frame, the gap in her front teeth, identical to the one their daughter inherited. He had spent 7 years believing he knew everything important about the woman he married. Every story, every wound, every reason she held her family at arm's length. Tonight, for the first time, he realized he might have only ever known half of her. His phone buzzed on the table, lighting up the dark kitchen. An unknown number. He stared at it a long moment before answering, half expecting Richard, calling to push the promotion one more time. It wasn't. The voice was old, rough, unfamiliar. "Is this Mark Dawson?" the man asked. Mark's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" There was a pause long enough that Mark thought the call had dropped. Then the voice came again, quieter, almost careful. "My name is Walter Whitfield. I believe you met my daughter today at the school." Mark gripped the edge of the table. "I'd like to see my granddaughter," Walter said, "and I think it's time you and I finally talked about what really happened to my Claire." Mark sat frozen in the dark kitchen, the phone pressed hard against his ear, his heart pounding loud enough that he was certain the man on the line could somehow hear it too. Because in 7 years of grieving, in 7 years of believing he understood exactly how he had lost his wife, no one had ever once used the words, "what really happened." Not the doctors, not the police report, not even Claire's own sister, just hours earlier, standing at the school gate, with tears in her eyes and a secret she still hadn't finished telling him. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, long after the call ended, turning Walter Whitfield's words over and over in his mind. "What really happened to my Claire?" Until the sentence stopped sounding like English and started sounding like a threat. By morning, he had made his decision. He dropped Emma at school with a kiss on the top of her head and a reminder that he loved her more than rocket ships, then walked the 2 blocks to Bennett's, with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, bracing himself for whatever Diane had been carrying alone for 7 years. She was already there when he arrived, sitting in a back booth with 2 untouched cups of coffee going cold, her eyes red-rimmed like she hadn't slept either. Mark slid into the seat across from her without a word. "My father called you," she said quietly, not a question. "He called everyone last night, including me, including our lawyer. He's not used to losing control of a story." Mark leaned forward. "Then tell me your version before his gets here." Diane wrapped both hands around her cup, staring into it, like the truth might be easier to say to coffee than to a person. "The night before the wedding," she began, "Claire came to my apartment. She was supposed to be at her rehearsal dinner. Instead, she showed up at midnight, soaking wet, and told me she'd just found out our father had threatened you." Mark went very still. "Threatened me how?" Diane's voice dropped lower. "He told her if she married you, he'd make sure you lost your job within the year. He had connections everywhere, Mark, more than you ever knew. Claire begged him to leave you alone, and he told her the only way to protect you was to disappear from his life completely. Cut him off. Take your name. Never use Whitfield again. Not for herself, not for any children she had. That way there'd be nothing left for him to threaten." She finally looked up, tears spilling freely now. "She didn't walk away from our family because of pride. She did it to keep you safe. And she never told you, because she didn't want you carrying what it cost her." The coffee shop noise faded around him, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of other tables, all of it dissolving into a kind of ringing silence. 7 years he had believed Claire simply preferred a quiet life, a small life, just the 2 of them, building something simple out of nothing. He had never once imagined she'd built a wall around him on purpose, brick by brick, and let everyone believe it was about pride instead of protection. She loved you enough to disappear, Diane said softly. And I loved her enough to let her, because I understood why. I just never forgave myself for not finding a way to stop him instead. The bell above the door chimed, and Mark looked up to see Walter Whitfield standing in the entrance, older and smaller than he'd looked across the parking lot the day before, his charcoal coat now looking less like armor than something he was hiding inside of. He walked slowly to the booth and stood there, hat in his hands like a man at a funeral. "I owe you an apology," Walter said, his voice cracking on the first word. "Not the kind people say and mean nothing by. I drove my daughter out of my life with my own hands and let pride keep me from fixing it, even after she was gone. I have a granddaughter I have never once held, because I was too proud to admit I was wrong while there was still time." Mark studied the old man's face for a long moment, searching for the threat Diane had described, the cold calculation that once promised to end his career before it began. He found only an old man who had spent 7 years alone, with a mistake he could never undo. "I'm not going to pretend this fixes anything," Mark said finally. "But Emma deserves to know where she comes from. All of it. The good and the bad." Walter's eyes filled, unable to speak for a moment. "And the promotion," he added quietly. "Whatever you decide has nothing to do with me anymore. I'll see to that myself." Mark almost laughed, a small, broken sound, because for the first time in 2 days, the promotion felt like the smallest thing in the room. That evening, Mark picked Emma up at exactly 3:15, same as always, and this time, Diane was waiting by the gate too, no longer hiding, no longer afraid of being seen. Emma ran straight into her arms before she even reached her father, and Diane laughed, a real laugh, lifting her off the ground the way family does. Mark stood back and watched them, his daughter and her aunt, 2 pieces of Claire that had finally found their way to each other, and he understood for the first time that some promotions you turn down, not because of what you're running from, but because of everything you've already found. If this story reminded you that love sometimes hides in the quietest sacrifices, stay close, subscribe, and let's keep finding these stories together, because every single one of them is worth telling.